Okay, welcome back, everyone. Just a quick announcement. There'll be lunch upstairs at 1:30 after this, so welcome to our last panel for now. So anyways, my name is Basil Fadoun, and I'm a graduate student here at the Center for Russia, East European, and Eurasian Studies. I'm also a captain in the Army Special Operations Force, where I serve as a psychological operations officer. As someone who works in influence and more specifically human behavioral change in foreign target audiences, I think you'll find a lot of value and great insights from this panel today in light of the evolving nature of great power competition today. So I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for this panel, Dr. Sean Guillory. Dr. Guillory went to Dartmouth College, where he received his PhD in cognitive neuroscience, followed by postdoctoral research at Anderson Cancer Center, where he worked on mapping behavior and cognitive functions in brain tumor patients. He then moved on into the data and robots domain with organizations including Consumer Affairs, Clear Channel Communications, and some other notable ones. Dr. Guillory has made the study of human behavior positive, negative, and everything in between his life's work. At Booz Allen Hamilton, he's blending this knowledge with expertise in robotics and automation to help organizations protect themselves from emerging threats and to better enable the warfighter to navigate rapidly evolving technologies such as machine learning and artificial intelligence. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Sean Guillory.
Oh, already. Thank you so much. All right, microphone's working. Thank you all for actually being here, especially since definitely a wackier title. And even probably the very beginning, I'm just going to talk about what the heck I and kind of my group were concocting when we were thinking about the term cyber. I guess also just to talk about the kind of things that I'm currently involved with. I have a very fortunate position really focused on the innovation and R&D for things within defense and national security that may even be more, they tell me, look like 5 and 10 years down the line. And what could that look like in terms of even looking at stuff today? And on top of the position that I have at Booz Allen, I'm a board member for the Information Professional Association that has a lot of folks in terms of information operations, information warfare, PSYOP and the like all over the world. So I hear those conversations. I'm also very fortunate to be board member for both Mind Science Foundation and for the Society for Neuroscience in terms of the neuroscience scholars. So even on the academia end, I hear all these different things and how they kind of come together. And kind of where I'm just seeing these things where even through the talks, I think nothing individually is going to be new. We've talked about the information, we've talked about the cyber. I'm glad to hear things about the economic and even on the community level. But that kind of weird integration where these dimensions and domains kind of cross together, be it the kinetic, the cognitive, or the information, how doing one thing and what it kind of influences the other, where we talked about how the information can lead to certain kinetic attacks, be it folks being inspired, whatnot, by mis and disinformation, or on the flip side, what's kind of been talked about, how all kinetic attacks have a message embedded in them themselves, even if we don't necessarily pay attention or kind of like plan for that. So be it in terms of kinetic leading to information and information leading to kinetic. Other things in terms of even on the economics and how that plays in, like sanctions can have the same effects as like a carpet bomb in terms of what it could do to an economy. And also having good information on the inside, we unfortunately see that with some of the things that we see in terms of like some of the initial context where some folks knew the recent Israel conflict was going to happen. They put the right bets on the stock market because they knew it was going to happen and cashing out on that. So using information and insider information to help you out in terms of your funding your kind of kinetic operations. Even these kind of like next talks that's going to be coming up, I'm excited to hear in terms of like the sci-fi, but we see these things where stories are becoming reality, and then unfortunately with like the case in terms of like the Chechen, like, and just any kind of kinetic attack being turned into content in the information space to be fought in the information war. So the bodies and, you know, in actual physical contact being used for that. And even for the things in terms of AI, I don't know if it kind of went into this conversation. Unfortunately, I wasn't here yesterday. This may seem kind of bizarre, but this is kind of like where we're going, where folks are already using these AIs as their therapists. You see these things in terms of like virtual boyfriend, girlfriends, and like really in terms of believing that. And you even see these things where folks put all this information and data that they have from loved ones that pass away and kind of use that as a proxy to kind of communicate for, folks that have passed. And when you get to putting that into a potential metaverse or a spatial computing standpoint, and let's say again, like, a regular hack that could take down all those different things in terms of those virtual loved ones that people will go for, that's something that people will actually like really fight and probably give up their lives to protect, even if we all just say, oh, it's data and virtual. And that's probably where we're kind of moving more towards, where even in terms of where the information is coming from is going to be hard to tell. Is it come from the information space, the physical kinetic reality, or is it something just, in the head? And that's kind of where I put in terms of like, these are cyber attacks, just kind of blend them all together in terms of a term. Not a term that we have to agree with, but that's kind of the conceptualization that I kind of wanted to give to y'all. And when I was even thinking about who to be on the panel, I tried to think of the best folks I knew who were at the integration of multiple of those kind of dimensions, this panel may end up being more for me, for even anybody else, but I hope to be like for, helpful for the bigger crowd. But it's something where, again, like I think each and every panelist, which I'll give an individual question to everybody, and then we'll kind of have group questions, and I want to leave a lot of time for open discussion, including folks who are like, oh, this wild, or, want to, talk even more. So with that, like I said, let me pass off in terms of the first question with the panel, which would be to General Fogarty, which for folks who don't know, which I think, again, we have like a lot of maybe Army Cyber folks even in the audience, but in terms of being in charge of Army cyber operations, bigger kind of cybercom operations, and then being the one who really helped push doctrine and thinking around information advantage in the Army space, General Fergu is the one who kind of put that together. So again, very happy to have you. And kind of the first question I have is, like, if you could tell everybody here what you think, and again, it could be like Sean, it's not points that you kind of brought up, but how would you conceptualize the modern battle space? Even as compared to like 20 years ago, like how would you, like what are the different elements, actors, you can focus on the kinetic and the, any kind of thing. I'd love to hear that kind of conceptualization. I think everybody would benefit from hearing it, sir.
Hey, Sean, thanks for the question. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here at University of Texas at Austin. And as you kind of look at the bios, I'm the only one who doesn't have a doctor in my name. So I'm not sure how I ended up on this panel, but I think I could get here in time. Look, I'll do one even better, not 20 years ago, but 40 years ago. So when I came in the Army back in the early 80s, 1984 to be exact, there was kind of an old ditty. The Army had transitioned from the Vietnam War. They were really looking at all things Russia. Imagine that, right? At that time, it was called the Soviet Union. But something happened in the Middle East. Imagine that, right? The 73 Yom Kippur War, and where the Air Forces were using doctrine, equipment, tactics from the Soviet Union, and they invaded Israel. And it was a wake-up call because of the lethality of the battlefield, the speed of operations, the complexity of combined arms operations. The Israelis had really this unshakable faith in the power of their Air Force, and that worked until the Egyptians put SA-3 batteries and SA-6s and SA-8s up on the front line, and they stripped that away, and then it got into, frankly, a fist fight And it was courage, it was local initiative, it was massed effects of fires, it was the ability to make decisions very, very rapidly that carried the day. And it was incredible courage, bravery, skill on both sides. But that influenced that change in the Army, this idea of air-land battle, which was we had to fight outnumbered. And what they did was they went to school and they said, these are the weapons, we've seen them in action. We know that the Russians have learned lessons from what the Arabs did with their doctrine and their equipment. And so it fundamentally shaped a generation of not only just the Army, but really the Air Force also. It was this idea that you do have to combine operations, you have to work with your allies, and that this is going to be a very lethal battlefield. And so the old ditty used to be, if you can be seen, you will be shot. If you are shot, you will be killed. And at that time, the premier Soviet tank was the T-62. And it fired a 115 millimeter shell at slightly over a mile a second. So just imagine that, this tungsten penetrator, which if it hits you, is going to kill you. There's absolutely no doubt. And the air above that battlefield was just as lethal. And so it was a pretty daunting prospect of having to face that. So what's changed in the 40 years, or almost 40 years, since I put on the uniform? So one thing that has changed is this idea of persistent observation. So it's from space, it's from the ground, it's physical, it's virtual, it's multispectral, and I'll tell you, it is a game changer. And we saw a little bit of this as we fought a bunch of guys in Afghanistan and Iraq. But the big difference was we were the only ones that had that capability. And now we're not the only ones. Lots of people have it. And that is a huge difference. And so that's one that is large enough that I think it shows, not just an evolving but a changing characteristic of war that we're going to have to fight under. And your digital breadcrumbs that you leave behind, you're going to have to be aware of, and you're going to have to manage that. So signature management, whether it's from an IR sensor, we're dragging out camouflage nets again. But just a standard camouflage net is not good enough. It has to be able to defeat hyperspectral and multispectral capabilities. If you got to the National Training Center today, you are going to leave your cell phone behind or you're going to be killed. They will track you and they will kill you. And that was a lesson learned from 2014 from the early initial reports of the little green men that went into the Donbass and Crimea. But it's a huge difference. I can't imagine actually operating in those conditions. Lethality, man-portable. So we like to talk about the $1 million missile that shoots down a $10,000 drone, and that happens all over the place, right? What about the $75,000 missile that can take out a $2 million tank? And so what we're seeing is the lethality and the proliferation of weapons. One of the things that really concerned me was man-pads, so man-portable air defense systems. So think of a Stinger missile or the old SA-7 missile when Libya fell, because Gaddafi had stockpiled thousands of these things, thousands of anti-tank guided missiles. And those things just kind of disappeared into thin air. And so the concern was, terrorist groups, but what we see now is just tremendous proliferation of those capabilities. So if you're hit today, you're going to be killed. And it could be that first-person point of view drone that flies in the window. You've probably seen the videos on that. But there's a lot that you're not seeing. And so whether it's hypersonic missiles, at the high end, kind of advanced conventional munitions, but this proliferation of smart munitions that have completely changed the battlefield. And many of them do dual purpose, right? They serve dual purpose because they're a sensor and they're a killing or defeat mechanism. That's a significant change. The battlefield is non-contiguous and it's non-linear. And some people may challenge that. They'll say, well, Steve, there actually is a front line in the Ukraine. And there is a front line if you think physically, but what about virtually? And so this idea of looking at the battle space as a 360-degree, all domain, all environment thing or entity is really important. Now, we don't always have that physical linear battlefield. But what I will tell you is don't just look at the physical, you have to look at the virtual. And when you do that, you look at the battlefield in a very different way. Ubiquitous autonomy. Okay, ubiquitous autonomy. We have systems, and that's for both defense and offense. So think about some of the videos that you're seeing in the information environment with Hamas striking Israeli armored vehicles. In most cases, they're not striking the vehicle because the trophy system that's on that vehicle senses, detects that it's being shot at, and then that bullet, that RPG round or the ATGM, is actually getting shot, and the explosion you're seeing is that round actually being shot and exploding before it hits the armored vehicle. So you, as a human being, you can't react fast enough. Think about in the Red Sea with the Houthis shooting anti-ship missiles. You never want to get to the point where the phalanx is shooting that missile down. That means it has evaded every other countermeasure. But at the last seconds, essentially, because they're engaging at about 2 miles out, okay, with that weapon system. So that's how fast you are at something that's flying just subsonic speeds, and it's shooting the arrow. And you don't want the man in the loop in that, right? Because you won't react fast enough. And in the cyber world, what we're seeing, particularly with AI, is this idea of acceleration. So it's velocity, speed. I'll talk about both those because those are critically important. If you look at the changing character of the battlefield and of operations, is autonomy is not only here, it's going to be critically important, and it's important for both offensive and defensive reasons, both physical and non-physical. Multi-domain, multi-environment, again, physical and virtual. Who would have thought that the Ukrainians would sink the majority of the major combatants of the Russian flank in the Black Sea, including the flagship of the fleet? And they did that because they had the ability to sense, create understanding that enabled decisions and action faster and more effectively than the adversary. And then they had to be able to assess in real time each one of those steps and then the entire kill chain. So again, sense, understand, decide, act, and assess faster and more effectively than the adversary. And this gets to this idea of speed. Speed is not a principle of war. It should be, particularly on the modern battlefield. So we may not be teaching it at West Point or University of North Georgia or the Citadel or the War College, but I'm telling you right now, speed is what I'm most concerned with as a military commander. It's unprecedented. So it's not just the hypersonic missile, that physical. A lot of this is the cognitive. It's how fast can you adapt to the environment that you're thrown in. There's a great book that we read, I think, for the first time at the Staff College. You probably need to read it when you're an ROTC as a military officer, and it's America's First Battles. And I'll cut to the chase. We don't generally do that well in our first battles. we pay a heavy price in blood and material, reputation, national treasure, and I'm telling you, in this pressurized information environment, we can't do that. And you look at what happened to the Russians. Now they've had a lot of time to recover a little bit, but that reputational damage is something that I'm not sure they'll ever be able to overcome. There's also a first mover advantage that we have to consider. Okay, data centricity. Again, sense, understand, decide, act, and assess faster and more effectively. That's in every domain. It's in every environment. It touches absolutely everything, to include autonomy. Velocity. So speed and precision, and to a certain extent, there is a quantity there, but very concerned about velocity of every cycle, every operational cycle. And if we don't adapt to that factor, then we can have the best weapons, but they'll be shot on the ground before they're ever launched. We'll be shot in the assembly area. We'll be shot in these big Taj Mahals that we call tactical operations centers. The adversary will run rings around us. So your first principle has to be organizing yourself to sense, understand, decide, act, and assess faster and more effectively than the adversary. And then the last thing is, one of the things we do have to consider is this idea of win without fighting. So if you look at what's happening in the Ukraine, some of the pundits have come back and they said, all that information stuff doesn't matter. What really mattered was heavy metal. What I will tell you is I absolutely disagree with that point of view. Every situation is going to be different. Every environment is going to be different. We have to be able to understand that. We have to be able to go absolutely high end, but we also have to be concerned about adversaries who really don't want to fight us. Russia doesn't want to fight the United States. China doesn't want to fight the United States. No one wants to fight the United States unless they're in for this war of attrition that you see from terrorist groups. What they want to do is they want to win without fighting. And they're going to do that by building up some equivalent parity that makes us think about taking this thing on. But very importantly, they're going to work to undermine us, destroy our confidence, undermine our institutions, and essentially paralyze us. And then at the end of the day, they get to do what they want to do. And they've done that without actually having to fight. Now, they're going to contest us. They're going to confront us. I think a lot of it's going to be in the information space. And the complexity of all this is to be able to understand when you talk and then when you fight. And if you make a decision to fight, you have to decide to win. There's no bonuses or bonus points for coming in second place. And so it's a very complex battlefield. For those young men and women who are actually trying to knit all this together, they need all the help they can get, because I don't think it's ever been tougher. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Like I said, wonderful encapsulation in terms of the modern battle space. And like you said, how to almost go about all those elements and what kind of expertise need to be brought to the table. In terms of thinking of that, that's why I wanted Dr. Pyke to be here, because in terms of the different fields that you kind of touch, be in terms of cognitive science and AI, human-computer interactions, neuroscience, and the fact that, again, you're also looking at this in terms of also like the more defense kind of capacity, which again, like makes that combination even more rare. I'm really curious to hear from you. What do you think are the different expertise that need to be really at this table for this force to really go after this modern battle space, including maybe expertise or fields that aren't traditionally at the table, or maybe even like fields that need to be created to get at that table? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, I don't know that I'm going to meet that tall order, but so I'm a civilian and I work at the Army Cyber Institute, and my educational background's a bit atypical. So I did my master's and my undergraduate degrees in electrical and computer engineering. And then I realized that actually I was much more interested in how humans process information than how computers process information. So I did a pivot and did a PhD in cognitive science, which was an interdisciplinary program that included psychology, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence and cognitive modeling, which is, unlike artificial intelligence, sort of computational models that can predict how humans will react to various stimuli. So due to this background, the cyber domain is kind of near and dear to me because it is also characterized by this interest in both technological and cognitive aspects. And in terms of the Department of Defense, we're tackling several challenges as we try to bring this cyber domain to bear in the context of sort of multi-domain operations that General Fogarty was talking about. And obviously, a huge challenge is the rapid, ongoing evolution of technological capabilities and the need to creatively conceive how we can capitalize on those capabilities to support our missions. To compound that challenge at a more sort of human cognitive level, we need to also rapidly update our soldiers' knowledge bases and their perception of warfare to complement this changing and increasing technological capability base. And so my area actually that I'm going to talk a little bit about is less about the actual direct application of the cyber domain against adversaries, but more on sort of raising internal awareness and combating maybe some silos internally to make our forces more aware of and able to coordinate the cyber domain and multi-domain operations. And so we heard that, for example, PsyOps is within Special Forces. So it's sort of like a separate unit. And sometimes, you know, your soldiers in non-cyber units don't have a very good or well-developed conception of what the cyber domain is and the vulnerabilities and opportunities that it affords in a tactical context. And so even although psychological warfare is pretty old, the cyber branch only became a distinct Army branch about 10 years ago. And the leaders who stepped up to man this branch, to staff this branch, they came from other branches. And for the most part, sort of spoke cyber as a second language. And since then, the cyber school has been training the cyber branch soldiers. But then there's still a vast number of non-cyber and non-PsyOps soldiers that need to be made aware of our cyber capabilities and how they can be integrated in a multi-domain context. So just as there's research sort of on the civilian side about cyber threats and social media disinformation challenges, one of my areas of research is sort of raising awareness and enhancing awareness of our cyber opportunities and vulnerabilities in tactical military contexts among non-cyber specialists. This raising awareness of this need for sort of tactical cyber literacy among non-cyber soldiers was brought up by Heatherly and Melendez in a Cyber Defense Review article titled Every Soldier a Cyber Warrior. And so that's kind of an approach that we're trying to take to raise that awareness. So a challenge to that is, of course, physical aspects of warfare like bullets and IEDs are, they have a long tradition in the traditional military training and war stories, and they're violently and directly salient to our senses. In contrast, cyber and information operations are often sort of invisible. For example, we can intercept, track, or tap into wireless signals, communication signals. Our databases, we can hack databases, or our databases can be hacked by remote, unseen hackers. And, our information operations can change the sort of invisible beliefs of target audiences. And so all these sort of invisible things are literally out of sight and out of mind. And so it's sort of a cognitive educational challenge to raise awareness of these vulnerabilities and capabilities in a tactical context. So, for example, I've employed techniques like concrete analogies to help sort of raise awareness of this multi-domain mindset. So, for example, I have a quick and dirty task that I developed called the problem anticipation task, which is a bit like threat casting, which you may have heard about yesterday. And it's a task where an individual, a soldier, is presented with a mission, description of a mission, and their task is to list the possible things that could go wrong on that mission, either due to adversary actions or other factors. And sort of my research interest was to see, well, how many of those issues are, your traditional physical issues that they identify, or, more cyber, electronic warfare, or information operations issues. And you can probably guess that the percentage of those issues that are raised by your average soldier are very low. And so there's sort of room for improvement and better dissemination of those capabilities and vulnerabilities. And so, like I said, one technique I used was concrete analogies. So I had people read a fake historical account of a mission, an old-time historical mission where they were using carrier pigeons to transmit information, and wireless signals mirror signals from a hilltop to a hilltop, or light signals that then got tracked by the enemy and gave away their position, and hot air balloons doing reconnaissance like drones did. And having been exposed to this story, and then asked to do this problem anticipation task, they were much better at sort of translating those analogies into their modern invisible equivalents, like jamming wireless signals, etc. And another approach that we're taking is visualizations. So on a map, we can see tanks and ships and hills and the physical elements of warfare. And so I've been experimenting with maps that sort of show the invisible wireless signals, or cyber assets like the satellites and the cell phone towers and the informant holding the cell phone and things like that. And again, this research is ongoing, but again, the hope is that this will increase multi-domain awareness and allow people to sort of see the unseen and appreciate its value. Thanks.
Thanks for that. Yeah, so fantastic in terms of, even the different ways and the approaches, to help out in terms of this modern fight. So I said, I really appreciate you sharing that. In terms of also how academia and whatnot can really bring kind of foothold in this fight. Dr. Stroud, it's in terms of, so looking at this maybe in terms of bigger society, and in terms of where media and politics, because General Fogarty was talking about, that line that is usually that we talk about in terms of these are the front lines, or especially in the information space. Unfortunately, a lot of these things, when we're talking about mis and disinformation, are inherently political themselves. And for folks who do stuff in terms of DOD and IC wanting to remain as nonpartisan as possible, that's where sometimes we feel like our hands are tied. And you following that polarization and whatnot for a good long amount of time, even before I think a lot of folks caught on. I'd love to hear your thoughts in terms of how the media and politics kind of are really into this battle space, not just journalists kind of reporting, but it talked about in the audience, that delineation between journalists and info warrior is just kind of really nice. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. What an amazing conversation so far, and I'm really excited to dig into this a bit. So I approach this from the angle of non-military, and I approach this as a scholar of communication and media and psychology to try to understand what exactly are the effects and how is it that people encounter some of this information and what can be done as a consequence. And so what I'd like to do for a couple of minutes with you today is really focus in on the role of social media and how that has such a pronounced influence in terms of how the public gets information and forms misperceptions, and how this really is an important contributor to what General Fogarty called undermining institutions. This is really the place in which some of that work takes place. So to start with, I thought I would do a little bit of contextualizing the problem of how this happens on social media platforms. And I think at a basic level, it's very easy for any actor, whether domestic or foreign, to utilize the affordances of social media to distribute mis and disinformation. And typically those are distinguished with disinformation being the intentional use of information to misinform the public. And so that's been well documented that that's the case. Indeed, many of the major social media outlets will actually broadcast when it is that they've taken down some of these efforts on the platforms. But I think that there are some contextual factors to consider here. The first is when we look on these social media platforms and you look at how far and how fast misinformation spreads, studies that have been done suggest that misinformation on these platforms spreads farther and faster than the truth. And I think that that represents a real challenge, because if you're trying to counter these efforts, it's really difficult to do, because misinformation is, of course, more novel, it's more interesting, and it catches fire quickly, whereas to try to combat that is more challenging because you don't have novelty on your side. You're really trying to combat something that already was diffused through a network. There was also research published looking at how many people are exposed to this type of content. So is this something that everyone sees? And it turns out that the exposure to mis and disinformation, as well as the sharing of this type of content, tends to be really concentrated among a smaller group. So it's not something that every single one of us, every time you log on to any social media platform, is going to be confronted with, but it is influential nonetheless. There's also research saying that this is not only social media, but that we need to look at platforms as well. So one of my colleagues recently published something that when people are going on to Google, for example, to try to find out whether or not something is true, that it can actually reinforce the misinformation because of how they're searching for that information to begin with, leads them to data voids where there's really no good quality information there. And so they end up believing this even more fervently afterward because they didn't find a source that was corrective. So I think that gives a sense of the problem. It's there, it's available, it's increased the virality and speed with which misinformation can be shared. It's not something that everyone is affected by, and it's pervasive across different platforms, even if we think about search. There are a number of techniques available to platforms to use to try to curb some of this problematic content. So of course, trying to deter it in the first place is a strong incentive of many platforms. So this could be in the form of trying to make it not financially rewarding to share misinformation with the purpose of trying to get people to go to these sites and where you see ad farms, for example. It could also be the extent of punishment when you find out that someone is in fact using these social media platforms to spread mis and disinformation. And this includes the biggest deterrent that social media platforms have, which is kicking people off of the platform. And of course, working with law enforcement when it interferes with national security. And then the area in which we've been really interested is also thinking about what happens after this information has been shared with the public, and how is it that social media should inform the public about potential sources of misinformation that they've encountered and provide them with corrective information, which turns out to be a really challenging aspect, not only because of their desire to remain nonpartisan, but also to even get that information in front of people. So I think there are lots of challenges, but there are techniques at the disposal. I think that the most interesting aspect of thinking about this is what levers do social media companies have at their disposal when they're trying to confront this? And this is where I've been involved in a collaboration since the 2020 presidential election with Meta, with a group of academic researchers. It's the first time that a social media company has collaborated with academics in this way and given us access to data that aren't typically made public, that are kind of behind the scenes. And what we really wanted to understand is what happens when you turn different levers on social media. And with particular relevance to this conversation, what are the implications of that for untrustworthy sources and the information that they share? So social media platforms like Meta are always detecting untrustworthy sources on the platform. Their main strategy for doing this is they're sharing content with third-party fact checkers, who are then labeling content as okay, truthful, or not okay, false. And then whether you're a page or a group or a user, you accrue strikes. And at a certain point, you've accrued enough strikes that they then demote you or they engage in more serious actions. And so some of the things that we did in this collaboration that I think are of relevance here are, first, we tried to understand what really is it about virality and how does that influence the way in which mis and disinformation spread on the platform. And so we tackled this by looking at untrustworthy sources or sources that third-party fact checkers have said have shared problematic content in the past. And so we first looked at reshares, and so this is the ability on social media to share one piece of content and then share it again. And what we did is we worked with engineers within Meta for a group of consenting participants. So these were people who gave their permission for us to change their social media feed. And on Facebook, what we did is we removed all reshared content from their newsfeed. So they couldn't see any content that had been reshared. And one of the outcome variables of interest for us is what happens then to content from untrustworthy sources. And what we find is that when we remove reshares, we actually reduce exposure to these untrustworthy sources. And we reduce it by about 30%. So I think this gives an indication of how these networks are operating through virality. They are relying on reshared content to amplify their message. And this is, of course, great news for them, because if you're sharing it interpersonally, then that only adds credibility to the problematic information. A second aspect that we looked at is the algorithm itself. So both Facebook and Instagram have algorithms that prioritize content on the basis of people's engagement with it, and their goal is to increase your time on the site to give you an engaging and rewarding experience. And so what we did is, again, with collaboration with Meta engineers and a team within Meta, is we switched the algorithm off for a group of participants, so that instead of algorithmically ranked content, we instead included chronological content. So whatever a friend would have posted most recently would show up first, and then the content after that. And again, we wanted to understand what is it about the algorithm that might have an effect on how information travels. And again, with untrustworthy sources in particular, when we switched off the algorithm, it increased exposure to content from untrustworthy sources. So on Facebook, switching off the algorithm resulted in about 69% increase in exposure to information from untrustworthy sources, and on Instagram, a 22% increase. So I think what these sorts of studies show and how they contribute to this conversation here today is that we need to understand how social media act as a critical lever in these information operations. They're a way in which foreign adversaries and domestic actors really try to influence the American public, and the way in which social media is architected, the way in which it's set up, can amplify some of those messages. Now, I've only shared with you the results from these studies in terms of untrustworthy sources. And anytime you change a dial on social media, you not only change one thing, you change a lot of things. So you might change exposure to untrustworthy sources, but at the same time, you're changing how much time people spend. You're changing where people allocate their engagement resources. And so all of these kind of simple fixes of, oh, let's just stop reshares. Oh, let's just switch off the algorithm. They have outcomes that we might consider to be beneficial, but at the same time, they have some detrimental public outcomes. And happy to discuss those more. But I wanted to hopefully add to this conversation the importance of social media, the levers that are at their disposal, the complications of turning those levers when we think about how the public can be influenced.
Thank you so much for, again, like in terms of even those data points. And again, just that rare look in terms of being able to have almost like causal kind of inferences in terms of even if you do have to kind of have a whole bunch of variables at once. Again, that kind of, because a lot of the times it is more correlation based. And even in terms of the measurements, what you'll just see perennially in this space is talks of measures of effect and how do you know how much you're actually influencing folks or not, or even just how to research these things. Some of it, a lot of it on the methodology side, and other side being what one can even like ethically in terms of like getting through institutional review boards and whatnot. And with that kind of context, that's why I wanted to have Dr. Thomson, who in terms of researching and funding things all around this dimension and just being a constant like conversational dance partner on some of these, you're probably the first one to hear even about, the cyber kind of stuff, even a little back in the day. So want to bring you to talk about that. And if you'd want, in terms of, I want to at least give you time, and then I want to open up to everybody. If you want to talk even just wider what you think in terms of research in general needs to be done, let me just open up the aperture a little bit more for you, but let me give you the floor, sir.
Okay. So my name's Rob Thomson. I'm a cognitive science fellow and associate professor at the Army Cyber Institute with Dr. Pyke. One of the things I want to talk about in terms of research that I'm interested in, and it ties into where I think some research needs to happen, is that I've been trying to look at consumption of mis and disinformation, or just consumption of information more generally in a cognitive lens. We've seen a lot of work and a lot of discussion coming at the social lens, at societal lens, at policy. But there's also the ability to study this from understanding like what is happening on individual beliefs in human memory. We've known from Ebbinghaus in the 1880s that human memory operates on a power law of learning and a power law of forgetting. And for people who don't like math, that's the extent of what I really want to talk about on this. But we know how this works. We know that most of our decision making comes from recency, frequency, and order of incoming information. And if you're in a space where you're studying biases, there's this big bias wheel, there's dozens and dozens of them. From a cognitive standpoint, you can trace a lot of these biases down to just different factors of these elements. And one of the ways that we can kind of study this is by using what Dr. Pyke had mentioned, which is a cognitive model or a cognitive architecture. The idea here is that we essentially have a handle on, at least at some functional level of abstraction, how human memory and how human decision making happens. And we can instantiate our theories inside these models, which have been grounded in thousands of papers over 40 plus years, and say, I think this exactly is going to happen. And why is this important? Well, there's a couple of things that are important about it. One is I get to peek under the hood in a way that I cannot do outside of like neuroimaging and an fMRI machine. And what does this mean? There's a body of literature on like nudges, like when do you nudge someone to try to change an attitude or change a belief? Because a person can always say, I'm anti this, I'm anti that. And memory kind of operates on a first past the post kind of thing. It's called a race model. The highest memory tends to win out. It's what leads to the availability and confirmation biases. In practice, this means that whether you are 55% certain or 90% certain, you're almost always going to respond the same way. I'm anti this position. However, we really want to nudge the person who's closer to 50-50, or we want to find the techniques that work that can pull people back on the 90-0. And cognitive models are a way to do this. There probably 25 years ago, there was a lot of funding towards it. Nowadays, not so much. And I think there's trying to get a renewed focus, and that's going to help. I also think that some targeted psychological studies can really help support some of the larger social models that are out there. I've done some work on measuring belief bias, which is just essentially saying that when trying to evaluate arguments, you are biased to judge an argument based on how well it accords with your pre-existing beliefs as opposed to logical structure. And there's a couple of things that are interesting when you evaluate people. I have a colleague of mine and I who developed what's called a minimal explanation paradigm, which is a variation of like a logical reasoning task. And we measure people, we give them accuracy on how well they judge various arguments, and we ask them their confidence. And there's two interesting things. One, we can disentangle the difference between a predisposition to accept misinformation and a predisposition to reject true information. It does not have to be symmetrical. The other thing we can do is we measure confidence. Confidence allows us to kind of look inside the mind and get the metacognitive kind of understanding what's going on. And a scary thing happens. Depending on the study that you see in the belief bias literature, person's accuracy can drop 20% on judging logical syllogisms when actions kind of accord or don't accord with their belief. What you don't tend to see in studies that measure confidence is their confidence doesn't change. So you call it an increasing overconfidence. What it means is metacognitively, there is no signal that's saying something's wrong, memories aren't being compared, and that gives us a hint when we're trying to design a model as what's going on.
Excellent. I really appreciate it. We're right at 101. I do have 3 questions I can ask group, but I want to take it to I can ask them those questions whenever I want. And feel free, again, anybody that you think is interesting to follow up with us at any time. But let me open it up to the audience. There's a hand up there that's looking, oh, yeah. So he's ready. Again, anybody else who is there's even a second one. Yeah, I feel like an auctioneer right now. But again, I'm glad for the interest, but
Hi, Matt Armstrong. Thanks for the panel.
Oh, wow. Here you, sir.
I'm a PhD student, but I had a former life where I am an honorary inductee to the PSYOP, Psychological Operations Regiment. I also previously had the opportunity, the honor of drinking from the boot at a graduation ceremony. But I've also served in a civilian capacity as a former governor of the formerly named Broadcasting Board of Governors. So there's a civilian side, but I've also worked with Congress and helping write, cause, and pass legislation related to this space, as well as working with DoD, the five-sided Puzzle Palace, and CENTCOM, J39, for example, SOCCENT, SOCAF, and various things. So I'm going to ask this question, taking into account that my varied background to you, and what I want to do is promote you all. You are now POTUS. Taking the theme of this panel on the integration, you are now the president. You have a perfect cabinet. They will execute what you want, how you want it done in an efficient way without the friction that normally occurs. You have a perfect national security staff that will execute in the same perfect manner. What would you do to create education, awareness, integration, perhaps segregation? How would you fix the systems in place that are existent now? How would you want to see the design? How would you want to see the education and awareness? Because I've also worked extensively with Army War College, a bunch. In fact, 2006, there was a study about Hezbollah tracking Israeli cell phones and using it. So it's not just 14, if we go back further in that. So with that, how would you redo government? Where would be the lines? And if you just want to stay within the military side and whatever, I would appreciate that. Thanks.
Wow. I'll put that to the audience. I will say that would be, in terms of that kind of scenario, that would be like the hard part really is over, even get that kind of alignment and whatnot. That'd be amazing. But say we actually get to that point, yeah, if anybody would want to take it, don't be shy. Here it goes.
Oh, I'm going to be bad because I'm going to be like, can we start a new commission? But I think what I would like to see, especially because you mentioned education, is a commission on critical thinking. And my wife is going to yell at me because I have this nasty turn of phrase there's no such thing as that. And what I mean by there's no such thing as critical thinking is it's just how we rehearse information. There's nothing and So we say we need critical thinking. What we need is research onto rehearsal strategies that help us debias, because if you don't rehearse the information properly, you will actually polarize people when you think you're doing critical thinking.
Anybody else want to take that? All good if not, go ahead.
Okay. So kind of relating to what Natalie was talking about with social media. Now, I don't know if I'd need to be POTUS to do this, but I think, agents that seek to manipulate us use our character against us, and as Dr. Thomson said, our confirmation bias. So we tend to weigh information that agrees with our pre-existing beliefs highly and downplay evidence that seems contrary to them. But as, sort of the American character, I think, has other beliefs that we can leverage to protect ourselves. So I think we're all familiar with the phrase, if something's too good to be true, it probably is. And I feel like in person, in interactions with people in person, if there was someone kind of following you around, vehemently agreeing with everything you said and echoing your own ideas back to you, you would be suspicious. I mean, unless you're a narcissist, I think you'd be quite suspicious of this person and their motives. And yet somehow in social media, if a stranger is kind of blowing that sunshine your way in their post, you're like, oh, what an astute individual. This is very true and adds to the strength of my belief. And I think so we need to remind ourselves and remind the public that if something is too good to be true, it probably is. And I know Just Dawson spoke in a panel yesterday about how it's very easy to track our activities online and therefore target us with specific things that will play into our biases and our beliefs. And so if there is a message that we see on social media that is resonating too strongly with us, I think that should raise a flag for us that, hey, this is too good to be true. And I think also, a thing about Americans is, we don't want to be suckers. So if being susceptible to disinformation and misinformation is sort of characterized as be careful not to be a sucker on social media, I think that would resonate with a lot of people. And especially if we're reminded that some of those people who are trying to influence us are foreign actors. And we certainly don't want to be a sucker for them. So I think we could, there's always like moderation on social media, but I think if we could use our own cognitive biases in a way for us instead of against us, that would help as well.
I definitely want to follow up with that, but I want to make sure our audience gets asked their questions. All you.
Hi, Dan Cox, U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies. Mike Mosser and I are writing on this generally. We wouldn't call it cyber attack. We'd call it a cyber campaign. We think we see the Chinese, Russian, and Iranians testing out cyber attacks in critical infrastructure, energy, bank and finance, water supply, food supply, and healthcare, and that they can, as they perfect and experiment with information and cognitive attacks constantly, they could combine all these things into an operational campaign at some point in the future where America might be extremely polarized over an event and actually degrade or destroy American democracy. So I wonder if the panel has thought about more holistically a counter campaign instead of just going after, bad actors in the information realm and combating some cyber attacks.
I'd leave that open to everybody, and that would also go into the counter defense. And if we're talking about things like water supply, we're not just talking about attacking soldiers in terms of uniform anymore. This would be like direct attack. So even in terms of how to defend the citizens and things around that, and like I said, I'd love to hear that from everybody too. But thank you for that question.
So one of the things is this idea of failure to imagine, which you just described. If you look at the testimony, it was pretty striking. You had, I think, for most Americans, very credible voices who explained what was happening. I think what they provided was some context. And so it gets back to this idea of failing to imagine. So as we've done a lot recently on the PRC threat, and this was all part of that, we looked at two concepts that are all throughout their literature. One is you fight your way, I'll fight my way. The second is this idea of fighting without winning. If you look at much of the discussion, at least across US DoD, it's almost, we're going to refight the second battle of Leyte Gulf. And so, it's like, bringing a, knife to a gunfight. There are other options. And you have to be very careful. And I was a former, COCOM, so I was the CENTCOM J2 and the ISAF J2. And, we have pretty thoughtful adversaries. Sometimes it doesn't appear that way, but generally they are pretty thoughtful. And if you, the worst case is you have to fight us, and I mean very kinetically, and the outcome of that is very uncertain. And so, how do you fight or how do you win without fighting? And this is the space, right? It's a combination of cyber, malign influence. If you're China, it's economic, diplomatic power that you can apply against the target. And so I think we have to have a very holistic understanding of the adversary, what their strengths and weaknesses are, what their capabilities are, and you really have to run those out. Not just the most likely or just the most dangerous course of action in a traditional sense, but these alternate visions. So we've run a TTX to kind of take a look at that, and I think it's a viable course of action, particularly for China, if they're able to build the capability, do some of the things that they've done. But it's not just cyber. It's just not just malign influence. It's the fact that they have this very large military that they built that I don't think they really want to use. It's economic power, it's a diplomatic power that they're working on around the world. And so from my perspective, I think it's a realistic course of action. And as an intel guy, not a cyber guy, but as an intel guy, what I want to do is lay out these multiple courses of action, thinking enemy, they have lots of options, and then lay my collection plan so I can start to fill in the blanks, I can start to confirm or deny what courses that they're more likely to adopt. And so this whole idea of the old days, give me the most likely course of action. That's what we're gonna go against. Certainly at a strategic level, that's I certainly don't believe that's the way you have to go about it. But we're very concerned about what we're seeing, because I think there are indications that they've certainly diversified their options, and we have to be ready to deal with competition, confrontation, crisis, conflict, and as a global power, what we may find ourselves on that continuum of operations, that continuum of not just conflict, but continuum of operations, is we're gonna be stuck. We're gonna be fixed in a lot of different places simultaneously. So again, that induces a lot of complexity for us that maybe some of our adversaries don't have to deal with. But I think what you're talking about, it has to be written about, it has to be TTX'd, and you have to bring in some red team players who aren't constrained by kind of the conventional second battle of Leyte Gulf.
Yeah, so one more quick question, and then, yeah, I said.
I'll keep this really short. So Stephen Siegel, professor of Slavic and Eurasian Studies. Again, so really quickly, I'm just struck in this panel by this idea of psyops and cognitive hacking. I wonder if you might talk about scale. I'm a historian of maps, and I'm thinking about the 10,000 voters in Michigan, right? So on the level of disinformation, because in some ways, Texas politics, let us say, are predetermined for 2024, but what about the swing voters in the swing states and all those things that sort of ordinary citizens or voters have been asking about with the lures of fascism and the lures of authoritarian populism? How do you actually get this kind of scale of geopolitical threat and adversarial malignity, right, maligness, translated to those communities? This is a constant question that my European friends in the European Union ask me about. So I wonder if you can talk about the community level here for the feeling of threat or for the feeling of attack, such that content is created as a kind of counter campaign, not just some kind of reaction. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Dr. Stroud, did you want to even... Not to be presumptuous.
Sure, happy to just offer a few remarks. I think that there really is a scale and a geographical component to some of the things that we're talking about here. And from a geographical component, especially if you think of this politically, not only at the presidential level, but also at the local level, there's a lot of vulnerabilities at the local level. And I think your question is such a good one, is how can we help local communities deal with some of these threats that they're facing? When I think about that in terms of social media, that really actually isn't an answer, because social media are most concerned with tackling mis and disinformation that has broader scale. So if it's something that's just targeted toward a smaller community, that's unlikely to be picked up by social media and the mechanisms that they currently have in place. And so I think maybe as a way to bridge several of the questions, I think creating groups, whether it's at the local level or at a national level, of people from very different constituencies that are coming together to think about what some of these challenges are and how we can build resilience and how we can just have relationships in place before any of this happens, I think is really critical. And I think we learned that from COVID, frankly, where we thought, oh, we have a vaccine, job done. And we recognize now that that's absolutely not the strategy that you need to put in place, that you need really diverse constituencies thinking through the diverse ways in which people are going to respond to information. And I just think some of the work that you all have mentioned demonstrates that as well. So that would be my response.
And with that, please give a round of applause for, again, this wonderful panel. Thank you all for staying here. I know lunch is next. And yeah, feel free to track us down if you want to ask any individual questions, but thank you so much for being here.